It's Tuesday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. The Prime Minister is to make a statement on defence and security. We'll be live in the Commons. Also today, Conservative leader Keir Starmer calls for higher defence spending.
We may be witnessing a more fundamental reset, perhaps a return to the world of the strong and the weak. And in such a world, we must not be weak.
After the Prime Minister's statement, we will be joined by the Senior Cabinet Minister, Pat McFadden. Joining me in the studio, the Labour MP, Conor Rand, Conservative Alex Shelbrooke, Liberal Democrat MP, Pippa Heylings, and journalist and author, Ella Whelan. This is Politics Live. Hello and welcome to the programme. Keir Starmer is going to be making what we expect to be an important statement on defence and security in the Commons. We are expecting that in about 20 minutes or so, and we will be bringing you that live. He is, of course, heading to Washington on Thursday to meet President Trump. There's been a lot of discussion about defence spending levels in the context of America's shift in position towards European security and, of course, the war in Ukraine. So we will be listening to what the Prime Minister says when he stands up in the Commons in about 20 minutes' time. And after that, we are going to be speaking to the Senior Cabinet Minister, Pat McFadden. Conor, I mean, this looks to be a pretty big moment, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And I think it is, as the Prime Minister has said, perhaps a once-in-a-generation moment to ensure the safety and security, not just of Europe as a whole, but of our nation, and to really show going forward how we are taking defence and the security of our country and our citizens very seriously indeed. So, yes, it's a big moment for the government, a big moment for the country, and I hope we see a very strong statement from the Prime Minister, and I'm sure that's what we will see. Right, so an acknowledgement of the new reality and Britain's response? Absolutely. I think everyone can see that the tectonic plates of global politics have shifted, and that requires a response from our government, a response from our European partners and friends, and indeed a global response, which is what I think we've seen this week. Alec, what is the response you want to hear from Keir Starmer?
Well, I mean, first of all, I don't think there's much I can disagree with there. There is a fundamental change. You know, every treaty and agreement that's put in place, President Putin has just torn up and ignored. There is a different relationship coming from the United States, and we're building towards the Leaders' Summit in The Hague for NATO in June, where I suspect there'll be an even bigger demand for funding. So there is a 2.5% plan in place. It's important that's delivered straight away, but it won't be the end of the situation, and the world has changed significantly. Right, so a 2.5% plan, you mean a commitment to get to 2.5% of GDP spent on defence by 2030. Do you think that is still enough? Because I want to play you a clip that we have had from Keir Starmer, your leader, who has been speaking this morning about foreign policy. She was asked about defence spending during the question and answers. Let's have a listen to what she said.
And on defence, it is not about picking, is it 2.4, 2.5%? We know that 2.5% by 2030 is now no longer enough. But we also know that our economy cannot support it. When I was in Cabinet, we talked about getting to 3% and we couldn't make the numbers work. So if we're going to do this, let's start doing what I talked about in the speech. Let's start looking at welfare. In the short term, we can repurpose development aid, for example. But the Prime Minister has some difficult decisions in front of him. He needs to get serious, he needs to get real, and then we will support him in doing those.
Right, quite a lot in there, Alec. I mean, 2.5% she's saying is not enough in this new reality.
And that's what I was just saying. No, the plan is there for 2.5 and you've got to move beyond. I was at the North Atlantic Council, the NATO Parliamentary Assembly last week, and what has been made clear to us is that for the Leaders' Summit at The Hague, they will produce a plan, present a plan to the leaders that shows what is needed for European defence, and their estimate is that will be over 3% of GDP, but it will be properly laid out to what each country needs to provide, what their economies can sustain. And so, again, we're into a different world, whereas at Wales in 2014 there was an ambition to get to 2%. This is what's got to be delivered, and this could cost more than 3%.
OK. Pippa, what are you expecting from Keir Starmer, and what are you hoping to hear from him?
Well, I think we're all agreeing here that this is an era-defining moment for European collective security and the defence of our democratic values. We've consistently pushed for 2.5% increase in defence spending, but we also think that we should get around the table to get a political consensus about how we do reach 3%, and that is our call.
Right, so you would support 3%. So if Keir Starmer stands up and says 2.5%, you will be saying that is not enough?
We will say that is right now, but we need to go further because this is absolutely... The tectonic plates have shifted in terms of the Western alliance. As the US withdraws, we are the ones now, the UK and Europe, that needs to step up and defend our democratic values.
OK. Ella, how big a moment is this?
Well, it is a big moment, but I think it will... The response purely of a financial nature is not enough. I mean, I think nobody's really... substantially answered J.D. Vance's call in the security conference in Munich, where he, quite painfully laid out all of Europe's problems, in particular our problem in the UK, which is that we can spend all the money we want, but we've got an existential crisis of not being able to defend our democratic values or not ourselves standing up for them, whether that's democracy itself, as the shenanigans over the last sort of decade in British politics have shown, or, values of tolerance, freedom of speech, these things that... And it's a terrible shame that J.D. Vance has to be the one who is defending them, given America's problems and Trump's problems with free speech. But, you can spend all the money you want on equipment, on, sending money to NATO, all the rest of it. But if you don't have the will within a population, particularly even the man and woman power of people to be able to defend us, then that's a problem. And we do have an issue at home here where, particularly younger generation don't feel able or willing to, defend their country's values. We don't even know what our country's values are. And so I think that's, I'd like to see a bit of that in the speech, something a bit more substantial that says this is why we should, not just this is what the amount of money we should spend, but this is why we should spend it. What has Ukraine taught us, and the Ukrainians fight for their own sovereignty, is that sovereignty is important. We should start making that argument at home.
OK, Conor.
Well, I think in this week of all weeks, we need to focus, and we are focusing, and the Trump administration is focusing, European partners are also focusing on the primary threat that we face, and that is the threat from Russia, which is an existential threat, not just to European security, but to our security. And of course, we need to ensure we have a strong, independent armed forces that can protect us. I hope we hear from the Prime Minister a strong commitment to the pathway to...
Well, should we be heeding the warnings from J.D. Vance, his observations on what's going wrong in Europe?
I think J.D. Vance and the Trump administration are right. It is important that European countries and our country have the ability to protect ourselves and to carry that burden as they have called for. That's why a commitment to 2.5 is so important. I mean, it's a significant commitment, particularly coming from where we are, which is the difficult financial position that everyone knows the country is in, and by the last government's own admission, a hollowed-out armed forces that we are needing to rebuild. And
so 2.5 is a significant commitment.
Yes.
You're not prepared to go further, as Pippa would suggest, to 3, or set out a timetable for going a bit further.
Well, I think the important thing is that we balance ultimately the need and the consensus we have for greater spending on defence, whilst at the same time not making unfunded spending commitments that put our economic stability at risk. We've seen the damage that those sort of unfunded spending commitments can do in our recent past. So, look, I'm sure the Prime Minister will set out a clear pathway to 2.5%. I think that's the right approach. And I think it's extremely important that we see that the funding is in place for any commitments we make on defence. And I think that's what the British people would expect from us.
Right. I mean, on the funding, Alec, the plan that the Conservatives had to get to 2.5% by 2030 was funded, apparently, by cutting tens of thousands of civil servants. At the time, that was criticised as not being a realistic prospect. I mean, Kemi Badenoch herself was honest that she said when she was round the cabinet table, they couldn't make the numbers work. Where should the money come from to get to 2.5% or even 3%, as Pippa suggests?
Well, look, I mean, the government are going to have to make tough decisions, as Jeremy Hunt pointed out yesterday. Just by bringing the welfare bill back to what it was pre-COVID will actually fund up to 3% over the 5-year period. Look, we have to recognise what we're... he's absolutely right to say that the armed forces were hollowed out and reduced throughout the 21st century and the last decade, of the last century, because we were in this post-Cold War dividend. Now, that took defence spending from 5% to 2%. Now, 3% of GDP went into welfare and the health service. There are difficult decisions to be made, but we are living in a very, very different world.
Can I ask you something that your colleague Bernard Jenkin, who was on the programme yesterday, said? We had a bit of a discussion about defence spending. He mentioned the idea of having a hypothecated defence tax to fund these sorts of increases. I mean, is that the kind of landscape we're in?
I don't think hypothecated taxes work. I think that, governments have to look at the income they've got, they have to work out where their priorities are, and they have to spend that money effectively.
Right, so can the increase in defence spending be funded entirely by cutting, or should we need to raise taxes instead?
Look, the government are saying that they are on an efficiency drive throughout every department and what they want to do. Within that, and we'll see what the Chancellor may be saying later on after the Prime Minister, you would hope that money's been identified.
OK.
So these tough decisions in the former government, those tough decisions included cutting 10,000, of our troops on the ground.
OK,
and
but
that's what got to reverse. I mean, that's not the kind of...
Fine, but now we're in a world where we're talking about upping defence spending. You're calling for 3%.
Yes.
I don't know if there's a timeline to that. Have you got a date in mind when you want to see 3% by?
I think what we have to do is get people around the table to get the political consensus to make sure we can work out how we fund this. And also we can get investment, because also there can be investment in terms of the technology that we have in the country as well. That's part of the growth that we could have to ensure that we pay for it.
You heard from Kemi Badenoch there saying that 3% wasn't possible when she was in Cabinet. Where would you find the money to get to 3%?
Well, that's why we've got to get everybody around the table to make the political consensus around this. I wouldn't agree with the kind of cuts that the Conservatives gave. And for Kemi Badenoch to be talking now about military security when she cut 10,000 of the troops, during their period in government last time, I just don't think that's...
I just would like to push back on that and say there were significant cuts in the Navy when we came to power, not least pushed by the Liberal Democrat Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Danny Alexander. So the Liberal Democrats cannot take a step back and say it was the Tories. This was the post-Cold War dividend that many people saw could be invested elsewhere.
Pippa, do you want to respond to that briefly? And then I will come to you, Conor.
But we've also consistently called for an increase in what we have in terms of our European collective security. That has also badly been damaged by the botched trade deals that have come out of Brexit and the damaged relationships with Europe. That's what we're also paying in terms of those...
You can take British trade deals as the reason that European countries weren't spending 2% of GDP on defence.
OK, Ella.
Well, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but none of you have responded to the argument that, the dilemma that we have, which is that you can spend all the money you want, but those cut troops aren't going to manifest themselves unless you have people in the country who want to put their lives on the line for a sense of their nation. And we don't have that. If you look at, for example, Keir Starmer made a big deal before he became Prime Minister of saying, I'm going to embrace patriotism and, it's not going to be a dirty word for the Labour Party anymore and we love the flag. And it amounted to a few flags behind him at conference and that was about it. We have a serious issue in education, in the way, a young generation is socialised about how you talk about a country. Now, I'm not suggesting we suddenly get boosterish about English history or anything. I mean, this is a thorny issue for me. I'm from an Irish background and I'm no great fan of the British Army in some instances. But, you have to be able to tell a new generation, convince them of why they're going to utilise the money you've spent on whatever it is in defence spending. But none of you have any answers to that question.
No, I mean, first of all, I think it is simplistic to think about our defence spending simply by the number of troops. Of course, we live in a very complex military picture. That's why it's right to have the Strategic Defence Review. That's why, in terms of the conflict in Ukraine, the provision of drones and other things is very important.
They don't fly themselves. The thing about Ukraine was that...
I would just point out as well that, we have given the armed forces the biggest pay boost they have seen in a considerable amount of time to try and address the recruitment and retention issues.
If you look at Ukraine, the thing about Ukrainians was whether they were, hairdressers or estate agents or from all different kinds of backgrounds, decided to take up Kalashnikovs and fight for their country.
When their country was invaded.
Exactly, but maybe... And And, you know, that is a large part of it. But it's also the fact that in Ukraine, they have a much different, you know, particularly young people have a different relationship to their nation than we do in this country.
Can I just say that?
A recent survey, just very briefly, a recent survey showed, I think it's relevant, that, you know, it was something like 10-20% of young people think that, you know, their country is institutionally racist. I mean, you can have an argument about that, but that tells you something about what a young generation thinks about their nation, and it's not positive.
Okay.
So how do we start making the positive case that we want them to put on uniform?
Just in the rallies on the 3rd anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine yesterday, I can tell you the young people on the streets, where there was a sense of outrage and defence of what they see as our democratic values, was to hear nobody calling out from these parties the fact that Putin is the dictator and is the aggressor and caused the invasion of Ukraine, started the war. And yet we have the defence, J.D. Vance's defence of free speech under Trump, who voted alongside Russia, North Korea and Belarus in the UN, and a UN resolution which was only affirming that it was Russia which started the war. So I don't say that J.D. Vance's, you know, defence of free speech helps us all at all
It's a
anywhere.
bit like listening to the Lib Dems talk about democratic values, isn't it?
OK,
you know,
right.
The irony's there.
OK, well, we are keeping our eye on the Commons because Keir Starmer is about to make his statement shortly on defence and security. We're expecting that within the next 5 minutes or so. We know this is coming ahead of his visit to Washington on Thursday, where he is going to meet President Trump. There's been a lot of speculation as to whether he was going to announce this timetable for upping defence spending there. It looks as if he could be preparing the ground for his visit on Thursday. But one European leader who has gone before him is Emmanuel Macron, who met President Trump in the White House yesterday. Let's have a look at what happened.
Just so you understand, Europe is loaning the money to Ukraine. They get their money back.
No, in fact, to be frank, we paid 60% of the total effort, and it was through, like the US, loans, guarantee, grants, and we provided real money. To be clear, we have 230 billion frozen assets in Europe, Russian assets, but this is not as a collateral of a loan because this is not our belonging. So they are frozen. If at the end of the day, in the negotiation we will have with Russia, they're ready to give it to us, super. It will be loan at the end of the day, and Russia will have paid for that.
If you believe that, it's okay with me.
That was President Macron there, live fact-checking Donald Trump in the White House, grabbing his arm. Conor, is that the way to deal with President Trump when Keir Starmer goes there?
Well, I think when Keir Starmer goes there, the way to deal with President Trump will be to emphasise our shared commitments and endeavours to peace and to a resolution to the conflict in Ukraine. That's something that President Trump has spoken strongly about this week. That's something that we all want to see. So that's how I hope that Keir approaches those discussions.
Should he try and be as honest as President Macron tried to be amid all those smiles?
Well, I think when it comes to diplomacy and when it comes to these talks, everyone is going to have their own perspective and priorities.
Conor, I'm going to cut you off there because Keir Starmer is on his feet in the Commons. Let's have a listen.
That this was not given to the media. I will absolutely have an inquiry into this, but I would not be that discourteous. I spoke to you this morning, Mr. Speaker. I wouldn't be discourteous to you or to the Leader of the Opposition in that way, or to the House, and I give you that assurance from this dispatch box. And I apologise to the Leader of the Opposition, and I will make that inquiry. Mr. Speaker, 3 years since Russia launched its vile assault on Ukraine, I would like to address the international situation and the implication for Britain's national security. Mr. Speaker, in my first week as Prime Minister, I travelled to the NATO summit in Washington with a simple message: that NATO and our allies could trust this government would fulfil Britain and indeed the Labour Party's historic role to put our collective security first. I spoke of my great pride, Mr. Speaker, to lead the party that was a founding member of NATO, the inheritor of the legacy of Clement Attlee and Ernest Bevin, who not only stood behind Winston Churchill in wartime, but won the peace by establishing the great post-war order here and abroad. Mr. Speaker, it's a proud legacy, but in a world like ours, it's also a heavy one, because the historical load we must carry to fulfil our duty is not as light as it once was. We must bend our backs across this House because these times demand a united Britain. And we must deploy all of our resources to achieve security. Mr. Speaker, as a young man, I vividly remember the Berlin Wall coming down. It felt as if we were casting off the shackles of history, a continent united by freedom and democracy. If you had told me then that in my lifetime we would see Russian tanks rolling into European cities again, I would not have believed you. Yet here we are, in a world where everything has changed. Because 3 years ago, that is exactly what happened. Britain can be proud of our response. British families opened their doors to fleeing Ukrainians. The yellow and light blue fluttering on town halls and churches the length and breadth of this country. And the party opposite, in government, was robust in our response. I supported that in opposition. I applaud them for it now. And we have built on that, bringing our support for Ukraine to a record level this year. Mr. Speaker, we should not pretend that any of this has been easy. Working people have already felt the cost of Russian actions through rising prices and bills. Nonetheless, one of the great lessons of our history is that instability in Europe will always wash up on our shores, and that tyrants like Putin only respond to strength. Russia is a menace in our waters, in our airspace, and on our streets. They've launched cyber attacks on our NHS. Only 7 years ago, a chemical weapons attack on the streets of Salisbury. We must stand by Ukraine, because if we do not achieve a lasting peace, then the economic instability, the threats to our security, they will only grow. And so, as the nature of that conflict changes, as it has in recent weeks, it brings our response into sharper focus. A new era that we must meet, as we have so often in the past, together and with strength. Mr. Speaker, the fundamentals of British strategy are unchanged. I know that the current moment is volatile, but there is still no good reason why they cannot endure. So let me spell out to the House exactly how we will renew them for these times. First, NATO is the bedrock of our security and will remain so. Yeah. It has brought peace for 75 years. It is as important today as the day on which it was founded. Putin thought he would weaken NATO. He's achieved the exact opposite. Yeah. And it remains the organisation that receives the vast bulk of our defence effort in every domain, and that must continue. Second, we must reject any false choice between our allies, between one side of the Atlantic or the other. That is against our history, country, and party, because it's against our fundamental national interest. The US is our most important bilateral alliance. It straddles everything from nuclear technology to NATO, to Five Eyes, AUKUS, and beyond. It survived countless external challenges in the past. We fought wars together with the closest partners in trade, growth, and security. So this week, when I meet President Trump, I will be clear. I want this relationship to go from strength to strength. Yeah. But, Mr. Speaker, strength in this world also depends on a new alliance with Europe. As I said in Paris last week, our commitment to European defence and security is unwavering. But now is the time to deepen it. So we will find new ways to work together on our collective interests and threats, protecting our borders, bringing our companies together, seeking out new opportunities for growth. Third, Mr. Speaker, we seek peace, not conflict. And we believe in the power of diplomacy to deliver that end. That, of course, is most pressing in Ukraine. Nobody in this House or this country wants the bloodshed to continue. Nobody. And, Mr. Speaker, I've seen the devastation in Ukraine firsthand. What you see in places like Bucha, that never leaves you. But for peace to endure in Ukraine and beyond, we need deterrence. I know that this House will endorse the principle of winning peace through strength. Yeah. So we will continue to stand behind the people of Ukraine. We must ensure they negotiate their future, and we'll continue to put them in the strongest position for a lasting peace. Fourth, Mr. Speaker, we must change our national security posture, because a generational challenge requires a generational response. That will demand some extremely difficult and painful choices. And through those choices, as hard as they are, we must also seek unity, a whole society effort that will reach into the lives, the industries, and the homes of the British people. I started this statement by recalling the era of Attlee and Bevin. And of course, this year we will mark many anniversaries of that greatest generation. We must find courage in our history, courage in who we are as a nation, because courage is what our own era now demands of us. So starting today, I can announce this government will begin the biggest sustained increase in defence spending since the end of the Cold War. Yeah. We will deliver our commitment to spend 2.5% of GDP on defence, but we will bring it forward so that we reach that level in 2027. Yeah. And we will maintain that for the rest of this Parliament. And let me spell that out, Mr. Speaker. That means spending £13.4 billion more on defence every year from 2027. But, Mr. Speaker, we also face enemies that are sophisticated in cyber attacks, sabotage, even assassination. And so our intelligence and security services are an increasingly vital part of protecting both us and our allies. So on top of the funding of 2.5% that I've just announced, going forward we will recognise the incredible contribution of our intelligence and security services to the defence of the nation, which means taken together we will be spending 2.6% on our defence from 2027. But, Mr. Speaker, we must go further still. I've long argued that in the face of ongoing generational challenges, all European allies must step up and do more for our own defence. So, subject to economic and fiscal conditions and aligned with our strategic and operational needs, we will also set a clear ambition for defence spending to rise to 3% of GDP in the next Parliament. Yeah. Mr. Speaker, I want to be very clear. The nature of warfare has changed significantly. That is clear from the battlefield in Ukraine. And so we must modernise and reform our capabilities as we invest. I equally want to be very clear that, like any other investment we make, we must seek value for money. And that's why we're putting in place a new defence reform and efficiency plan, jointly led by my right honourable friends, the Chancellor and the Defence Secretary. Yeah. This investment means that the UK will strengthen its position as a leader in NATO and in the collective defence of our continent. And we should welcome that role. It is good for our national security. It is also good for the defining mission of this government to restore growth to our economy. And we should be optimistic of what it can deliver in those terms. But, Mr. Speaker, in the short term, it can only be funded through hard choices. And in this case, that means we will cut our spending on development assistance moving from 0.5% of GNI today to 0.3% in 2027, fully funding our increased investment in defence. I want to be clear to the House. That is not an announcement I am happy to make. I'm proud of our pioneering record on overseas development, and we will continue to play a key humanitarian role in Sudan, in Ukraine, and in Gaza, tackling climate change, supporting multinational efforts on global health and challenges like vaccination. In recent years, the development budget was redirected towards asylum backlogs, paying for hotels. So as we're clearing that backlog at a record pace, there are efficiencies that will reduce the need to cut spending on our overseas programmes. But nonetheless, it remains a cut, and I will not pretend otherwise. We will do everything we can to return to a world where that is not the case and rebuild a capability on development. But at times like this, the defence and security of the British people must always come first. That is the #1 priority of this government. But, Mr. Speaker, it's not just about spending. Our whole approach to national security must now change. We will have to ask British industry, British universities, British businesses, and the British people to play a bigger part. Use this to renew the social contract of our nation, the rights and responsibilities that we owe one another. The first test of our defence policy is, of course, whether it keeps our country safe. But the second should be whether it improves the conditions of the British people. Does it help provide the economic security that working people need? Because ultimately, as Attlee and Bevan knew, that is fundamental to national security as well. We will use this investment as an opportunity. We will translate defence spending into British growth, British jobs, British skills, British innovation. We will use the full powers of the Procurement Act to rebuild our industrial base. And, Mr. Speaker, as the Strategic Defence Review is well underway, and across government we're conducting a number of other reviews relevant to national security, it's obvious that these reviews must pull together. So before the NATO summit in June, we will publish a single national security strategy, and we will bring it to this House because, Mr. Speaker, as I said earlier, that is how we must meet the threats of our age, together and with strength. A new approach to defence, a revival of our industrial base, a deepening of our alliances, the instruments of our national power brought together, creating opportunity, assuring our allies, delivering security for our country. Mr. Speaker, at moments like these in our past, Britain has stood up to be counted. It has come together, and it has demonstrated strength. That is what the security of our country needs now, and it is what this government will deliver. And I commend this statement to the House.
That was Keir Starmer there, finishing his speech in the Commons on defence and security, on Britain's response to a world in which he said everything has changed, a new era. He said that we must meet together. So he announced that he would be reaching 2.5% of GDP in defence spending by 2027, funded by reducing the budget spent on international aid down to 0.3% by 2027. He also announced the commitment to get to 3.3% of GDP spent on defence in the next Parliament. There will be a slight boost of funding for the intelligence and security services, which he said were crucial to Britain's security response. He reiterated his commitment to NATO, rejecting, he said, the false choice between the US alliance and Europe, although he said that he wanted to deepen Britain's relationship with Europe. So a lot in there in Keir Starmer's speech in the Commons. I mean, Conor, can we take that headline of reaffirming 2.5% funded by cuts to the aid budget?
Yes, well, as the Prime Minister said, the first commitment and duty of this government, and indeed of any government, is the protection and security of its citizens. And I thought it was fantastic to hear the Prime Minister setting out a clear pathway and commitment to meet 2.5% of defence spending and bringing that forward from 2030 to 2027, and then talking about going even further than that. So I think it's a really strong statement about the importance this government places on our security, on European security, and on reaching a resolution in Ukraine.
OK, just seeing Kemi Badenoch, the Conservative leader, standing up in the Commons to respond to Keir Starmer's speech. We'll bring you a bit of her response. And if you do want to continue watching the full statement in the Commons, you can turn over to BBC Parliament. But we will bring you a clip of Kemi Badenoch responding to Keir Starmer's speech very shortly. I mean, Pippa, can I ask you? The aid budget was the target of this to fund this increase in defence spending. Was that the right call?
Well, as you know, we'd said that we've been calling for 2.5% increase in defence spending. We had also suggested how that could be paid for. I think we have to be really careful and scrutinise what this means in terms of a cut in our overseas aid budget, because we do know as well that, as well as the moral responsibility to the poorest in the world and the most vulnerable, this comes at a time of the US also cutting all of its aid funding, slashing the and closing down USAID. However, we also recognise that funding overseas aid is also about our national security too, and security of other countries, as unforeseen consequences of enabling insecurity as a result of poverty to rise. So we have to be really careful to scrutinise this. We're really worried about that decision.
OK, Alec, I mean, just come back on that.
Well, I mean, I believe, get BBC fact check on this, that 0.3% was the amount being spent in the Cold War. And, you know, we've discussed here widely today that the situation, the post-Cold War dividend is over, and that we have to start looking to the situation where we funded our defence in the past. Right.
I mean, the point is that we're coming down from where we are now. Yep. He didn't talk about tax rises. He talked about reducing aid spending.
Yes, and look, first of all, it is good news that he is reaching 2.5% earlier than was planned. It's also good news that he's moving towards 3%. I still think one of the critical points in this year is going to be the Hague summit, as the Prime Minister actually mentioned, in June, to make sure that the NATO alliance, especially in Europe, has its path mapped out as to how it's going to achieve European defence.
OK, I want to bring in now Pat McFadden, who is joining us live from Central Lobby in the Commons, Senior Cabinet Minister. Pat, many thanks for dashing over from the front bench to talk to us. 2.5% by 2027. You're bringing forward that target to increase defence spending, but you're cutting international aid to pay for it. It's exactly what President Trump wants to hear, isn't it?
It's a very important statement. The context of international politics has changed, and some of the assumptions that we've been able to cling to in the past are no longer there. The first duty of any government is to protect its people. The last time that defence spending was at 2.5% of GDP was under the last Labour government. The previous government had 14 years to do this and never did it. They had a number, but they had no plan to get there. And the Prime Minister has taken the decision today, not just to announce a number, but to explain how this is to be paid for, what it will mean for British and European security, what it will mean for the British economy, and how he's going to implement it. This is a really important moment in the country's security history, and a really important statement to Parliament today.
Why did you not think about an alternative route to get to that figure? Because there is already some discussion. We heard from the former head of the British Army, Lord Dannatt, yesterday, suggesting that actually this was a time to think about tax rises. You've boxed yourself in promising not to raise taxes. Isn't now the time, given the new security reality, to say actually we need to talk about broader tax rises instead of focusing everything on the overseas aid budget?
Well, some people may call for tax rises. That's not a route we wanted to go down. The British people have been asked to pay significantly more tax in recent years. We introduced some tax changes in the budget a few months ago. You may have seen some reaction in response to those. We wanted to do this in line with the fiscal rules that we've set out, and therefore there was no easy route to do this. I acknowledge that this is a very difficult decision. I acknowledge that soft power really matters. But the situation that we're in, it is necessary to increase our defence spending, and it's necessary to set out in a real way how you're going to pay for it. And that's what the Prime Minister's done today.
But you will have to think bigger eventually. I mean, you're promising 3% in the next Parliament. You will have to think bigger than further cuts to the overseas aid budget.
Well, the next Parliament is a few years away. We've set out a plan for this Parliament, and we've shown today that when we make a decision like this, we will actually set out how we pay for it. And if the time comes in the next Parliament that we have to do that, then again, we will have to look at how that is paid for. But what people can see today is not just a pledge to increase defence spending, to put the protection of the country first, to step up to the situation that we are faced with in the European continent right now, which is very different from the post-Cold War period where everybody thought these kind of conflicts had gone away. We've seen more state-on-state conflict in the last few years. We've had to step up, and when we've done that, we've set out today exactly how it will be funded. That's the level of honesty that the British people rightly expect.
I mean, that's also going to seem very far off, isn't it, to President Trump when Keir Starmer goes there on Thursday, 3% sometime in the next Parliament. He's calling for that sort of level now.
The meeting with President Trump is really important this week, but today's statement isn't a statement just for one meeting. It's a statement for many years. It's a statement to underline the responsibility that we have to protect the British people. You know, before the election, we used to talk about two essential tests of trust that had to be passed by any party of government. Those were sound management of the public finances and passing the test of trust on national security. That's even more true today, 8 months after that election, than it was before. And in the statement that the Prime Minister has made to Parliament today, he is underlining the importance of that test of trust and his determination as the country's leader to fulfil our national security responsibilities.
OK, he also said that it wasn't just about spending. He actually talked about a broader response across industry, universities, society. He said, what does that mean, a whole society-wide response to this new security reality?
Because the security reality is different. It takes into account cyber attacks, for example. The kind of equipment that we might buy with an increased defence budget is very different now compared to it was a few years ago, and it's precisely in recognition of those realities that we commissioned the Strategic Defence Review, which will report within the next couple of months, because it's really important, having committed this increase in defence expenditure, that the money is well spent and it's spent in line with the strategic priorities that we have. And that involves not just the Ministry of Defence, but it involves defence industries, it involves the best research capability in the country, and that's why he spoke in those terms today.
OK, Pat McFadden, many thanks indeed for joining us there from Central Lobby, giving us a reaction to Keir Starmer's statement about increasing defence spending. Ella, before we go, I do want to give you a chance to respond to what you heard from the Prime Minister.
Well, you know, it was very heartening to hear him reiterate the fact that it would be Ukrainians who, you know, must negotiate their future. But I'm disappointed in the characterisation of NATO as being as important as it was when it was first set up. I mean, it completely ignores the fact that NATO's treatment of Ukraine has been pretty appalling. And it was Russia who invaded, and the buck stops with Russia. But the context in which this war has come about can't be ignored. And, you know, the monkeying around with the question of Ukraine and NATO has left Ukraine both imperiled and undefended. And that is part of the reason why this is so tricky for them, and a bit of acknowledgement of that would be good.
We're almost out of time. Connor, do you want to briefly respond to the Prime Minister's recommitment to NATO?
Well, I think NATO is critical to our security future, and as the Prime Minister said, the bedrock of it. I want to see Ukraine become part of NATO. I think it has a right to NATO membership, and I think it will continue to be very important in our security for many, many years to come.
OK, Alec, very briefly, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, up until 2014, Ukraine had no intention of joining NATO, and there are several tests to join NATO which Ukraine still has to achieve.
OK, well, I'm afraid that is all we have time for today. Many thanks for joining us. I will be back tomorrow with more Politics Live. We will be taking Prime Minister's questions as normal at 11:15 here on BBC Two and on iPlayer. In the meantime, many thanks to all of my guests and many thanks for joining us.